All right, so hopefully you're watching this on Friday or on the weekend. And when we left off in class, some of you are at different places. So I'm going to go back to a place in our lecture where I think either most of you have gotten to, or a group or two didn't get to, and then I'll go from there. All right, so we were talking about the presidency of Andrew Jackson, and we started talking about the Tariff of 1828, which is kind of known in history to its critics as the Tariff of Abominations, which is like a really bad tariff. Remember that this was a tariff that was very, very high, and in particular, the South and the West, they saw it as a discriminatory type of tax because no matter where they got their goods from, whether it was Europe or America, the end result of them was a higher price on their stuff. And if you're like if you're somebody from the West, you rely on getting manufactured goods from the East or from Europe, and no matter where you get them from, the price is going to be higher. And so one of these places that takes exception to this in particular is South Carolina. And so John Calhoun, he writes this protest called the South Carolina Exposition, which brings back the idea of interposition. Interposition is the ability of a state to interpose or intervene state authority or state government power if they feel like the national government has gone too far, if they feel like they've done something unconstitutional, unfair to the states. Then a state could then move to what's called nullify, to make the law void, to make it gone, to make it a dead letter. And so this is what South Carolina hoped to do with the Tariff of Abominations. And so their state government, they basically said, well, we're not going to enforce this tariff. We're not going to, we're not going to make people pay it. And if they do have to pay it, then we're going to reimburse them. In fact, we're going to reimburse them double. So this is what South Carolina was going to do, and they thought that other southern states were going to join them. Well, back in Congress, there were debates going on, and one of the debates was over public land, but what it devolved into was this idea of, what states could do and what states could not do. And that inevitably led to the idea of nullification. And so two great statesmen during this time, one in particular, Daniel Webster of Massachusetts, and then Robert Hayne of South Carolina, they got into an argument in the Senate in which Webster took the side of the Union and Hayne the side of states' rights. And I think anybody that was there could tell you that Webster had the better debate and said that, if states are allowed to do this, then why do we even have a union? If we're going to preserve the union, you cannot nullify a law that the federal government makes. If so, then we are bound together by a rope of sand, which is to say, we're not really bound together by anything strong. We're going to have the Articles of Confederation over again. Nobody wanted that. And so really, Congress, on the idea of nullification, they said you could not do it. And so South Carolina basically stood alone. And Webster's speech has gone on to be one of the great speeches and debates that we've ever had in American history. He is kind of seen as one of the best orators that this generation had, and maybe that America had as well. All right, and so what this is doing is it's slowly but surely driving John Calhoun to become a states' rights guy, a sectionalist instead of a nationalist. Remember that he started out as a war hawk in the War of 1812. He's an ardent nationalist. After the end of the War of 1812, he's on board with Henry Clay's American system. But now, because of all of these things, this rift that has developed between he and Jackson, the fact that South Carolina is losing population, and they need him to serve in the Congress to promote their cause. Calhoun, in the election of 1832, he is off the ticket for Andrew Jackson. He goes back into the Senate for South Carolina, and this is how Van Buren kind of gets in with Jackson. All right, so to end nullification, Andrew Jackson gets Congress to sign this thing called a force bill. And the force bill just basically gives him authority to use the military however he sees fit to make sure that the laws in South Carolina are executed. And that is the job of the president. Now, under JQA, you'll recall that Georgia basically went against him and he did nothing. Well, Andrew Jackson's different. Andrew Jackson, you don't mess with Andrew Jackson. And so he starts moving, the military down to South Carolina, saying, "Look, if you don't enforce the tariff, then we're gonna make sure that you do with force." Now, it doesn't come to this because in steps good old Henry Clay, and he comes up with kind of what's known as the Compromise of 1833, which calls for a gradual reduction of the tariff over 10 years. And at the end of that 10-year period, then the tariff will be basically what it was before the tariff was created. And so that kind of ends the nullification crisis. But Jackson, his position is strengthened, and Calhoun, he is on his way to becoming a sectionalist. All right, the next important topic that we need to talk about with Jackson is Indian removal. Remember that Native Americans, they keep putting up a fight and they keep losing ground. And so here is more of that. And so we go back up to the old Northwest Territory. Black Hawk, who was a very fearsome warrior and leader, and his son, they were in a protracted battle between them and the U.S. military. It's really not that important of a war, other than yes, the natives lose. It's more important actually for the people that were involved in the war, and two people in particular that we'll see later in the Civil War period. And so Jefferson Davis, who later will become the presidency of the Confederacy, he's fighting for the U.S. regular army, and Abraham Lincoln is fighting for the Kentucky militia. And so we'll get to know those guys a little bit better. As for the Black Hawk War, this kind of clears natives out from this area, and Americans legitimize this area around Illinois and Wisconsin. Next, the Removal Act of 1830. This is probably one of the most awful pieces of legislation that our Congress has ever passed. And they passed it at the behest of Andrew Jackson. In a very manipulative statement, Andrew Jackson, read to Congress a speech in which he said, for the safety of these people, they need to be moved because we cannot stop white incursion into their lands. We need to put them on a place where Americans will never want to go. And, this is basically saying, hey, we need to get these people out of here. Even though money was appropriated for them, a lot of times the money was not used the way it probably should have been. Treaties were made with people that were not the true leaders of various places. And really, ultimately, what you need to write down about the Removal Act is this called for the forcible removing of Native American groups to west of the Mississippi River. And so really we're talking about the 5 civilized tribes. And so, you don't need to write all of them down, but you're talking about people like the Choctaws and the Chickasaws and the Cherokees and the Seminoles, these groups that are in the southern and southeastern part of our countries that make up a pretty decent chunk of people. We're talking, really tens and tens of thousands of these people that lived east of the Mississippi River, and now they are going to be forced to move west of the Mississippi River. And in particular, we're going to focus on the Cherokees and the Seminoles. All the other groups by 1838 have pretty much moved, but the Cherokees try to hold out, and they even get the backing of the Supreme Court, in which there's a case called Worcester versus Georgia. I know that looks like Worcester, but it's pronounced Worcester. So in Worcester versus Georgia, the Native Americans had basically sued to not allow white settlers to come onto their land. And you don't need to know a lot of details about the oath that people were supposed to take and all of that, but here's what you do need to know, is that John Marshall, who is still in the Supreme Court at this time, rules on behalf of the Native Americans, basically saying that white settlers had no right to go onto their land. Now, this is where Andrew Jackson's a pretty bad guy. He says, Marshall has made his ruling, now let's see him enforce it. And basically what this means is that the Native Americans do not have a friend in the executive branch. They don't have a friend in the president. And the president doesn't intend to do anything to protect the Native Americans, and he does intend to do everything to get the Native Americans removed. And so in the mid 1830s, we see that the American military by bayonet forces the Cherokees to move. And they move 1,500 miles from northwest Georgia to Oklahoma in what has been known in history as the Trail of Tears, in which about a third of the Native Americans died. All right, and then we have another group, the Seminoles. Now, the Seminoles actually they held out a little bit better, and they are down in the Florida area, and they held out, fighting against the American government, the American military, because they hid out in places like the Everglades. And what's kind of tragic about the end of the Seminole War is that their leader, Osceola, he was shown a banner of truce. The American government basically said they wanted to negotiate with him, and when he came in to negotiate with them, they arrested him and they took him. And pretty much after Osceola, the Seminoles, they had to either hide out in the Everglades or they just kind of disbanded. So to sum all this up, we did some pretty awful things to these people. And I don't mean to say we, but our government did. And, if you look at one of the worst presidents for Native Americans, you'd have to put Jackson really towards the top of the list, if not at the top of the list. Okay, here's the map of this. So you can see the Cherokees were in northwest Georgia, the Seminoles down there in Florida, and then you have the other Native American groups that end up somewhere west of the Mississippi River. All right, lastly, Jackson's battle with the Bank of the United States. Remember that Jackson does not like the Bank of the United States. He believes more than anything it's controlled by an Eastern elite, people that are not in the South and the West, and that they use the bank to put financial pressure on people in the South and the West. He doesn't believe that's fair. And at the end of this chain are the farmers, and the farmers are the ones that are hurt the most by what Jackson feels is unfair policies of the Bank of the United States. The other thing he didn't like is that this was not a government-owned bank necessarily. The government owned 1/5 of the stock, but the other 4/5 was owned by private investors, and many of those investors were British. And so it's kind of like in a way that much of the bank stock was owned by the British. And Jackson's just like, that's the problem. The government should be the one that owns 5/5 of the bank. We should control all of it. And so he saw to it as his duty to get rid of the bank in one way, shape, or form. Now, his rivals, in particular, up to this point, Henry Clay especially, that's the one, the main one. And then also up to this point again, John Calhoun. Those people had advocated for the bank as a way to keep state banks from loaning out too much money and being too over speculative. And so, add all these things up, and Jackson wants to get rid of the bank. Okay. Now, we're going to hear this throughout American history when we talk about economics, but we're going to talk about soft money and hard money. Okay, so soft money is paper money. That is money that can be inflated. The value tends to fluctuate quite a bit. And debtors, they like to be able to pay their debts back in paper money because oftentimes it's more abundant. It makes it easier for them to pay back their loans. Whereas hard money is specie. It's gold and silver. And, the banks tended to hold on to this as much as they could because that's real wealth. It's not paper, it's real wealth. And, the banks, they tended to like to be paid back in specie and in gold and silver. And so they didn't like getting paper money back. And what the bank did really well, and what Jackson failed to recognize, was that the bank created a good balance between hard money and soft money policy, in which the money supply was not too contracted to where it was just based on hard currency and there wasn't enough available credit, but also that they kept state banks in enough control that they could not just start printing off paper money and create a bunch of inflation. And so that's really what the bank did. Is they kind of regulated the economy and the money supply. And Jackson failed to realize once he gets rid of it that it'd make the economy go in these boom and bust cycles. All right, so Jackson, he refused to accept the Bank of the United States, and by 1832, and I've said this already, in 1832, then everybody that's involved in getting Jackson reelected or not wanting Jackson to get reelected, they were going to make the Bank of the United States an issue because the charter was going to run out in 1836. And people that supported the bank, they didn't want to wait that long. They wanted to get the bank rechartered again for the next 20 years. And so everybody just kind of decided to use it, whether they were for it or against it, in the election of 1832. Okay, so again, those are the things that the bank did. But again, Jackson kind of didn't see these things. So here you're likely to see this picture at some point, whether on one of my reading quizzes or on the AP exam or the semester exam. But when you see this picture of Jackson, he's fighting a hydra, which is a multi-headed serpent. And these represent different branches of the Bank of the United States. And the idea, the critics of the bank said, boy, if you cut off one head, it just grows another. And this bank is out of control. It keeps growing and growing and getting more and more powerful. The guy in the middle is supposed to be Nicholas Biddle. The person on the right is supposed to be, some foreigner that owns stock in the bank. So just kind of an interesting picture. And there's Jackson on the left with his saber slaying the Hydra. Okay, in the election of 1832, once again, Henry Clay has thrown his hat into the electoral ring. He's going to be what eventually we'll call the Whigs, but right now, again, they're still called the National Republicans. We do, for the first time, have a third party, and so this election is kind of an election of first, in which we have a third party called the Anti-Masons. And the Anti-Masons, I don't think you need to know too much about them, other than they were against the Masons. They were against the secret kind of fraternal order of the Masons. A lot of very powerful people were in the Masons, and so they developed a political party against them. Now, obviously, they don't do much in the election. They don't get any, like real electoral power or anything like that. So they're not really a factor that way. But what they do are three things that you probably need to write down. They're really the first political party that's a third party. That's one. Two, they use a nominating convention. Instead of using King Caucus, they use that presidential nominating convention. And eventually, each party is going to adopt that. And then the third thing that they do is they adopt a platform. Instead of just running, they have an organized, very public platform. Hey, these are the things we stand for. These are the things we against. And, that's something that our two major parties begin to develop, so that people know what they're kind of voting for when they vote. Okay, you can see in the election of 1832, Andrew Jackson wins pretty decisively. And other than Clay's home state of Kentucky, a couple other scattered places there, really this is a mandate. And that's what I want to show you, is that Andrew Jackson reads this election as a mandate. And what I mean by that is he says, you know what, virtually everybody voted for me. I have a lot of power now, and I'm going to get rid of this bank that I don't like. Okay, and so what Andrew Jackson does is, to get rid of the bank, he doesn't want to wait for the charter. He wants to basically get rid of the bank by taking the money out of it. And so he starts withdrawing money from the Bank of the United States and putting it in state banks, what we call pet banks. And these were banks that were willing to go along with Jackson's requirements and the things that Jackson wanted to do. And at the same time, not only did he start withdrawing money from the national bank, the Bank of the United States, but they stopped putting federal deposits in them. And so when money would come in from tariffs and things like that, it would just go into the pet banks, and it would not go into the national bank. And so he effectively made the Bank of the United States, powerless, worthless, because they didn't, what they had before was all of this money that they could then loan out to banks across the country, and those banks have to pay them back, or speculators or something like that. Now they don't have the money to do that, and it makes them effectively a weak bank. All right, in the picture down below, you can see Nicholas Biddle against Andrew Jackson in a pugilistic fight, a hand fight. And really, this is just a political cartoon talking about how Biddle, who is the head of the national bank, the Bank of the U.S., and Jackson, who's its opponent. And, Jackson, he's going to win, so to speak. Biddle realizes the benefits of the bank to spur manufacturing, to stabilize the economy. And, Biddle, he does probably the worst thing he can just to make a point to Jackson. He calls in loans to try to get money for the Bank of the United States. It contracts the money supply. And ultimately, what's going to happen here is that it's going to paralyze the economy. It's going to cause the Panic of 1837. So we'll get to that in a little bit. Maybe the next lecture or whatever. We won't talk about the Panic of 1837 too much, but this power play over the Bank of the United States is going to hurt the economy. And it's kind of interesting that it happens because a couple of people are fighting over their egos. All right. Now, I don't believe you need to know the Distribution Act or the Specie Circular, but these are two things that Andrew Jackson asked Congress passed to, kill the bank without, not rechartering it. And so the Distribution Act, this is where they give the money to the state banks, the pet banks. And then the Specie Circular talks about how payments can only be made to banks in hard currency. And again, many of the farmers, they didn't have this. This actually hurts them. But in kind of a weird twist, it seems like the killing the bus really hurt the farmers, but yet they don't blame Andrew Jackson for it. They believe that Andrew Jackson's fighting for them. And so Andrew Jackson's a little bit, like Teflon, just things don't stick on him. He's a man of the people. And even though he's kind of doing something that in the long run probably hurts the farmers, they don't see it that way. They blame the Eastern elite and people like Nicholas Biddle. Okay, so that is where we're going to end for today. When we get to the Taney Court, we'll start getting into Martin Van Buren and some of those other things. So we will end it there for today. Thank you for tuning in.